I have a slight issue with tournament arcs and training arcs. This is because of how they handle conflict and consequence. But I'll start with stories in general. All stories require conflict to make the plot interesting. A story without conflict goes nowhere. Conflict can come in many shapes and forms. When the level of conflict increases, so should the level of consequences. Consequence is necessary to show the stakes, the weight of the plot, and the character's actions. If characters don't face any consequences, the conflict feels too weak and easy to solve. It is underwhelming and unsatisfying. Here are some examples of negative consequences in different types of scenarios. In battle, natural consequences are injuries and even death. So in a battle story, injury and death should be common consequences, especially in high stakes. This should be amplified if characters have superpowers. In sports, consequences are getting knocked out of a tournament, loss on a record, or even sadness. This should be the same in stories. In romance, consequences are rejection and emotional pain. All of these consequences will usually also happen in a story that includes these scenarios as conflict. I take issue with stories that don't have a high enough level of consequence for their conflict. In a battle manga, when characters don't die and or sustain big injuries, especially when the stakes are high, it is comparable to a sports manga where when the characters lose, they don't get kicked out of a tournament, their loss doesn't go on their record, and they don't feel any sadness or anger. Imagine a romance manga where when the main characters are rejected or their love interest is stolen, they don't feel any sadness or a rift or awkwardness in any relationships involved with the romance. None of these examples feel realistic or satisfying. Who faces the consequences is also important. The consequences should happen to main characters or important supporting characters. If background characters die in a battle manga, it gives the audience an idea of what's at stake, but not nearly as well as killing an important character. If conflict happens, but only background characters die or get hurt, and no one important does, the stakes of the consequence don't register with the audience very well. Since we are in the perspective of the important characters, the conflict won't feel as dire as the author intended it to be. It's like irrelevant teams losing in sports, but none of the main teams, or background characters getting rejected and heartbroken, but none of the main characters. It can happen to background characters too, but consequences on background characters have less weight and impact than on main ones. With that out of the way, I'll start with tournaments. The first problem with tournaments is that they are a form of manufactured enforced conflict. Characters are forced to fight each other with no other motive than to win the tournament. The conflict doesn't arise naturally. The second problem is that they usually take place in a controlled environment. This means that the stakes aren't high, because the referee will step in if things become too dangerous. Additionally, this makes the plot predictable and formulaic, because there are rules that all combatants must follow. We know that a specific amount of characters will face off in a specific ring. We know that no one will be allowed to die, and that the winner moves on while the loser is disqualified. There's almost no room for unpredictability. The third problem is that tournaments pause the plot. From the audience's perspective, the world comes to a halt until the tournament finishes, putting the arc in a bubble separate from the plot. The characters may develop, but the overarching plot stands still, and the plot within the tournament is barely existent because of the formulaic structure and the fact that it basically happens in a bubble. We are watching characters be forced to fight one another with little to no plot in a safe environment. Tournament arcs are also long because they include many characters, so all of these flaws drag even longer. But tournaments are still cool and have their benefits. They display a lot of fights, give a reason for two characters who wouldn't normally fight each other to fight, and can effectively introduce many characters, which is why I'm fine with one tournament per story. Personally, it's also a better idea to have a tournament arc towards the beginning, because the stakes are usually low and there isn't much plot to push forward. There are some examples of tournament arcs that have managed to get around some of these drawbacks. The best one is Yu Yu Hakusho's Dark Tournament. This gets around the low stakes and consequences because the characters can and often do die during their battles. Additionally, if Yusuke loses, Tokuro will kill him and his loved ones. This makes the stakes as high as any regular arc. Naruto's tournament section of the Chunin exams also uses the possibility of death to reduce the stake problem, but it doesn't do it as well as Yu Yu, because not nearly as many fights result in deaths. In the final round of Yu Yu Hakusho, all 4 of the matches result in the death of a character, although older Toguro comes back the next arc. But there is one thing that Naruto does that Yu Yu Hakusho doesn't, and that's interrupting the tournament with plot. This had been building up throughout the arc and finally happened during Sasuke vs Gaara. This is something that counters the problem of the plot coming to a halt by stopping the tournament and starting the plot, which is more interesting. Stakes and unpredictability came back, and the tournament arc was able to conclude in a more satisfying way than if it had just finished the tournament. Earlier, I said that I'm fine with only one tournament, but Yu Yu Hakusho is the only anime with 3 tournaments that doesn't really bother me, and the reasons are because of how they all attempt to avoid and reduce the flaws of a tournament arc. Genkai's tournament is the first one. This is extremely short, most of the battles are also quick, and the number of contestants are small. This avoids the length problem and allows the other flaws to last for a very short period of time. The second is the Dark Tournament, which I already talked about. The third was in the Three Kings Saga. This tournament, while having a lot of characters, has short fights and the overall tournament is shown in fragments, skipping over the not so important parts. Only around 4 1v1s were shown. Yomi versus his son, Kurama's fight, Hiei's fight, and Yusuke versus Yomi. The last was the longest fight, but even that was kinda short compared to the Dark Tournament's fights. So like Genkai's tournament, it reduced the other issues by reducing the amount of time spent on the arc. Furthermore, the tournament is only the second half of the saga. The first half actually had plot and character development. This reduces the plot problem. 3 tournaments is still too much, but Yu Yu Hakusho found a way to manage. Finally, training arcs. For me, training included in an arc is different from a training arc. Stories like Fairy Tail, Naruto, Yu Yu Hakusho, and Bleach have no training arcs because no arc is solely based on training. Training arcs are like tournament arcs, but worse. They have every single problem that a tournament arc has, except for length. They also have the added problem of a lack of motivation. In a tournament arc, characters at least have the motivation of rank, approval, or money. In training arcs, there is no motivation to win outside of competitiveness and self-improvement, which is very weak. The stakes are also lower. In a tourney, the characters would be kicked out for losing, but there is usually no penalty for losing here, and if there was, it wouldn't be as large. Furthermore, tournaments had the benefit of introducing new characters, but training arcs usually don't have this. They use already known characters. Jujutsu Kaisen is a manga that has managed to avoid some of the flaws of training arcs. The best problem it avoids is the plot problem. JJK avoided this by having Gojo actually use primary antagonists to teach Yuji. The plot was moving forward as the training happened. This also means that the stakes somewhat came back. Although Gojo was too powerful for anyone to be in danger, there was at least a possibility that something could go wrong and create a consequence since it wasn't a controlled setting. It also avoided the problem of manufactured conflict because Gojo was actually attacked by the villains. He just used it as a chance to train Yuji. This is an example of a good arc dedicated to training. In conclusion, conflict and consequence are important and should match each other's level. Tournament and training arcs also have an issue with conflict, consequence, and more because they are in a natural form of conflict, have a low level of conflict, are too predictable and static, pause the plot, and are long, which extends all of these problems. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and check out my manga for free online. If you enjoy my content, please consider donating to my Patreon. All important links will be in the description.